We are doing once again we're doing what every pastor across this country hates. We're thinking for ourselves, delving into the Word, and finding out that, well, some things that we think are so just aren't so. I hope I didn't just cut into that live early. I think I got cut off. So let's just say Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Oh, there's a lap.
It happens. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm noticing that. We'll get probably about 1 second lag. I will try my best not to sound like I'm interrupting, because that usually is the cause of that. So we have today a wonderful show about Rachel, right?
Interesting. Yes.
Is it that much of a lag?
I'm testing the lag.
That's a long lag.
It is a long lag.
I will do my best to adjust for it.
Lag. Okay.
I think as the show goes on, it might close up a bit.
I hope. Well, I'm wondering. I wonder if there's any way to tell if the recording is going to sound like this when we're done. Because otherwise, I'm going to be talking over myself.
Yeah, I found a lot of times it does not. That the lag that we experience is actually dealt with in the automatic post-processing, so it sounds a lot more real time. Just think of yourself being on CNN having a satellite feed from Japan. You know, they usually have a couple second delays on things.
Oh, I wonder if I mute you, that might help. No, maybe not. Who knows? Okay. Oh, wait. I think I know what the problem is. Well, I thought I knew what the problem was.
Professional will do it, folks.
Yes, technical issues. Let's see. All right, I'm going to try turning off my other browser. That may be the problem. Oh, that is definitely the problem. Yay!
Bam! So, all right, let's test this. How late does this come across to you? 1, 2, 3.
So far, there's no lag.
Huh. Well, that's cool.
Let's start over. Happy New Year! We'll have Justin add the time cue at the bottom of this. Technical problem, skip here.
We need a technician. We need a video technician, a sound technician. Hell, we need a studio. We need a lot of things that we'll never have. God provides.
That's okay. So, in case anybody was wondering, that's not alcoholic. That's just regular spiced apple brew. But I've got half a bottle left from last week, so hopefully I get a chance to finish it this week.
Don't let it all go to your head too fast.
Yeah, well, and I can. That's one of the reasons I don't drink alcohol is I can get drunk on grape juice, on fizzy grape juice. Oh. So that, yeah. In this case, it's okay, but so originally I was going to do the previous episode one day before Christmas and this episode one day after Christmas, but I talked myself hoarse the last time. Only an hour and a half too. I'm not really sure how that happened, but I wasn't quite able to recover. Got an ear infection, and now I'm back. So I managed to get into New Year's Day, so this will work. Where we left off last time, we had the Annunciation from the angel Gabriel to Mary, and there were references to the Abrahamic covenant, and the big grand finale from last time was going back and looking at the Abrahamic covenant, and I had mentioned that a few times in previous episodes in some details, but this was the first time to really get back into it and look at the Abrahamic covenant and what it was about. And I didn't go into a lot of the Pauline statements about it because that'll just have to be done later. A lot later, because Paul is what we're doing last. So we're not starting with Paul. We're going to end up with Paul. because that's fair. And besides, it's better to start with Jesus and the things in the Gospels anyway. Obviously, Jesus is not directly talking or teaching in the nativity stories, other than the inspiration of them, perhaps. But there are still inspired things going on, and that includes Old Testament references, and that includes references to the Abrahamic covenant. And part of the deal with the Abrahamic covenant from last time is that Abraham is included in the covenant, but Abraham didn't actually make the covenant. The covenant was actually made between the visible Jehovah, or the visible person of Jehovah, and the invisible person of Jehovah, and apparently the Holy Spirit as something like a lantern swinging back and forth between them. That they would bring all of Abraham's descendants to righteousness someday, that they would definitely succeed at this. And consequently, this is why Paul, or the Hebraist, says later that the covenant made at Sinai was only with the Jewish people, and it could be broken, and it was broken, and it would be replaced later with a new and better covenant, and a truly eternal covenant. But the covenant of the promise cannot be broken, not ever, 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 because that promise was made between God and God in order to get this to work. And the goal that they're looking for is bringing all of Abraham's descendants to righteousness someday. Not eternally tormenting them, not annihilating them out of existence. They all have to be brought to righteousness someday. And then this has direct bearing on the incarnation of Christ, because both Mary and Zacharias, if I recall correctly from last time, both agree that this coming of Christ is going to help fulfill the Abrahamic promise to Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant. And how does that work? Well, it's because the visible Jehovah is standing in for Abraham as the seed of Abraham, as Abraham's descendant, in making this promise. And consequently, the creator of all rational souls everywhere of all time is making this promise, and is having been incarnated, not merely manifesting, but actually being incarnated into the line of Abraham as the descendant or seed of Abraham. He is now in a position to bring, consequently, everybody into the covenant. Everybody is included in the covenant promise. That means people who are not Jews. That means people who were born before Abraham. That means Abraham himself, even though he wasn't actually the one doing the covenant. Everybody gets included in the covenant promise. That's total scope of salvation, of bringing people to righteousness, saving them from their sins. And it's a total promise of victory, because God has basically staked his own self-existence, God self-begetting and God self-begotten, has staked his own self-existence on getting this done. That's universal salvation.
Right.
So that turns out to be something running around in the background of the nativity story at this point. And when you're talking about the Abrahamic covenant, that's not the only thing. We also covered some other stuff from chapters of Jeremiah 32 and 33, maybe 34, I can't remember exactly, where this was being referenced by the various people involved in talking about the promises of God. And it turned out a lot of those have to do with, universal salvation, actually. Not necessarily salvation from punishment. People are being punished. People are even being punished to death. But that's not the end. That's not the end of the situation.
I just want to take just a split second to talk about how so often this is conflated with universalism, is that we're saying that A, you can be saved apart from Christ, or B, that you're going to get off easy and that, you don't have to turn to Christ. It's nothing like that. I mean, how easy do we forget that passage in 1 Corinthians that talks about everybody passing through the fire? I don't think anybody gets get out of jail free ticket, but no matter who is saved, it is done by virtue of that work that Christ did on the cross, nothing else.
Right.
It's us.
Yeah,
that we
and
this
is the connection here. We've got the connection of the Abrahamic covenant. In order that the covenant will be kept and put into effect by somebody sinning, somebody has to die, has to voluntarily die in order to keep both sides of the covenant in effect. And so the sinless Son of God voluntarily dies to keep the covenant in effect. That's in a way that's, you could call that penal substitution atonement. It's also penal representative atonement, where the Son of God is suffering with the transgressors. He's being reckoned with the transgressors, not just instead of them. So, but both ideas are there, okay? And there's other atonement theories also that get factored into this, but I just wanted to point out that this has reference not only to the nativity and the incarnation, but also eventually the sacrificial death on the cross. So, but that was last time. That's a quick summary of what happened last time. There were some other things
our
also.
Summaries are never quick.
Our summaries are never quick because we cover a lot of stuff.
That's good.
So,
it's like superfoods, you know, being nutrient dense. You're very intellect dense.
It is very dense.
In a good way.
You'll need to go back and do the other episode, watch the other episode to get into the details of the other things that we were talking about in Jeremiah. We are going to be going back to Jeremiah, but I'm not going to be covering those other chapters all together in detail yet. So I did that last time, so you'll have to go back and read those. Okay, so excuse me, I've still got some drainage from my cold there. So now we're following.
Okay, I can't be the only redneck on the show.
Yeah, I'm in West Tennessee. So with that, we follow Mary back home to Nazareth to her husband, fiance Joseph. But technically, he's legally her husband. They haven't done the deal yet, but legally they were supposed to be married at this point. They're not living together yet exactly, but they're going through what's called the 1-year ban, so that everybody's making sure that they can work together and so forth and so on. Okay, Joseph was originally from Bethlehem, and so now we're going over to Matthew's nativity story in Gosmat. This would have to be the time, if not sooner, that Joseph learns that Mary is with child and not by him. See, we've got Mary got the Annunciation from Gabriel, and then she went to go see Elizabeth. And she stayed there for 3 months while Elizabeth finished her final trimester and had her baby. And now Mary is 3 months pregnant, and it's not really possible to keep that a secret anymore. So Matthew says in Gosmat 1:19 that Joseph, legally her husband, although they hadn't yet had the nuptial ceremonies, nor had they come together yet, didn't want to disgrace Mary because he was a just or a righteous man. This has some curious plot implications that don't really have anything to do with universal salvation, but I love getting into the historical stuff too. Primarily, I'm a Trinitarian and historical apologist, and that's how I got into universal salvation. So in my mind, whenever I'm going through these things, that's what I look at first. And then if there's cool soteriological stuff, then great. That's just, bonus. Now, had Mary simply been forced into having this baby by a Roman soldier, for example, which was the scurrilous rumor that was passed around later, there would have been no need for Joseph to act against her since she wouldn't have been at fault. On the other hand, he must not have thought she was simply fooling around. He might still have chosen to quietly divorce her, but out of sheer mercy to her or out of an attempt to avoid embarrassment to himself, that might have been a morally admirable act if it was by mercy, but it would have made more sense to explain he thought that way. In other words, it would have made more sense to explain he was being merciful to her to forgive her lapse or what he thought was their lapse and just go on. But instead, Matthew explains that he's acting justly in deciding to quietly divorce her so that she wouldn't be disgraced. Nor, according to the story, does he realize yet that she's miraculously pregnant. She either hasn't told him, or she has, but he thinks she's crazy, or maybe she's lying to protect somebody else. The story doesn't go into detail about that, and we only know that. I've always
been really fascinated by that. I mean, when you think about that, this is a crazy thing that you're talking about, and this is supposedly someone that he must have desired, and
right?
Then suddenly he finds out. I mean.
And finds out that she's pregnant, and she's either not saying how she got pregnant, or she's telling him a story that he can't believe.
And you got to think this is super uncommon for a dude in this position to just like be quiet about it, want to keep it hush hush.
Yeah, and he's trying to put aside the marriage and do it quietly so as not to call down shame on her, and yet he's being fair or just somehow to do this. Not exactly merciful, but he's being just. But he's also being merciful. True justice, which is God's justice, must be merciful, and all mercy must be truly just. But the choice of wording is kind of odd here. Now, I have a speculative theory about what's going on, and I'm going to, one of these days when I write a book about this, I'll probably talk about the speculative theory. I know it's better not to hang anything on it. It's just a pet theory of mine, and I'm going to skip over it for sake of time. about
well, that's on that rare occasion that we have too much material, right?
Yeah, that's one of those cases where I have too much material, and I'm just going to move along. Anyway, it's a case of where I think this theory will explain all the pieces and about what Joseph thought wasn't happening, but what he thought was happening, and also explains why Mary over in Gospel, when she's talking to the angel, she seems to be saying in Greek that she basically has taken a vow never to know a man. So anyway, but I'm not going to go into that. It's a long sort of theory. Regardless, Joseph never files the papers of divorce because an angel, he's not named as Gabriel or anything else. He's just called an angel of the Lord. But one supposes it's probably Gabriel, comes to him in a dream to reassure him that Mary has been faithful and it isn't an accident either. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, since doing so at this point could be highly damaging to Joseph's own honor. But his honor instead shall be as the guardian and husband of her who has conceived by the Holy Spirit, a son whom Joseph shall name Joshua. In Greek, transliterated to English, that would be Jesus. In Hebrew, that might be either Yahshua or Yahashua, which I think means the Lord. It depends on how many vowels are used.
Most of the sacred name movement people are going to say it would be Yahushua, to have Yahu, the name of Yahweh, and Shua, salvation.
Yeah, but sometimes they'll contract it too. It just depends on how many values you put in.
Yeah,
but it also makes a slight difference in the meaning of the word. It could be either the Lord saves or the Lord is salvation. Those are both good statements to be used in a name. And of course, it's a really common name. So, especially during the Messianic time here where people are expecting the Messiah to show up.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this harkens on the type of Joshua in the Old Testament. I've seen a lot of
people into the Promised Land.
Detail how the conquest of the land of Canaan really paralleled Christ's ministry.
Oh, that would be interesting to look into someday. I'll have to look into that.
I know he's not a good source for a lot of things, but one dude that I'd recommend for this one thing particular would be Chuck Missler.
Yeah, okay. Neat. So anyway, the reason that the angel gives for calling him Jesus is, for he shall be saving his people from their sins, which was the title for last episode, but I didn't actually get to this.
All by way of introduction.
Yeah. So anyway, not that he shall only be saving some of his people from their sins. And who are his people? Well, that gets into questions of soteriology, and Calvinists would say, well, his people are just the people that he chose to save, and that's all. Well, okay, all the people that he chose to save. Arminians would say he's chosen to save everybody. And each side has scriptural backing for this. But each side denies that the other side is correct in their gospel assurance about this. But now we're getting back to the question of the Abrahamic promise, the Abrahamic covenant between God and God. See, if Jesus was anyone less than the creator of all created people, that scope might be less than all people. But all people are God's people, created spirits from the self-existent Father of spirits. Immediately, God's people are Israel, but God's salvation, we know, goes beyond Israel according to the flesh, in accordance with the promise of God, by God, to God. his people shall at least not be some small remnant finally saved, although only small remnants might be saved in limited ways or for specific purposes along the way. But according to the Abrahamic promise, they shall number as many as the stars in the sky. Nor are God's people limited only to those who are already loyal to God, like the unfallen angels, for he shall be saving his people from their sins. Matthew explains by inspiration that this took place so that the prophecy from Isaiah 7 and 8, what we call chapter 7 and 8, would be fulfilled, leading into what we call Isaiah chapter 9. That prophecy originally was more literally about Isaiah giving a besieged and himself rather rebel king of Israel a sign that God would lift the pagan siege and save his people within a few years. And the virgin was a prophetess, Isaiah's own wife, who conceived normally when Isaiah went into her. Quote, quote. But there were two children that Isaiah prophesied about. One was born from a normal union with his maiden wife, and one, no one talks about him being born at all in the story of Isaiah. That's the one who would be called God with us, Emmanuel, who would be the coming of Jehovah himself to save his rebel people. And his rebel people are bitterly complaining about their imprisonment and punishment, but someday he's going to come and do that, as well as saving the pagans, the Gentiles. We talked about some of this last episode too, in the Christmas story references from previously in the story. Joseph obeys and completes the ceremonies of engagement for Mary to be his wife, but keeps her a virgin until she gives birth to the son, whom Joseph names Jesus. There is an implication from the grammar here that they go on to have other children too afterward, but that isn't strictly necessary from the grammar. If they did, they wouldn't be breaking a vow of Mary's chastity if my other little theory is true that we're not going to talk about. But that's, like I said, that's my own pet theory. I know not to hang anything on it. Jesus' brothers and sisters might have thus been from Mary, or they might have been only from Joseph by an earlier marriage, or possibly both. However, if Joseph had children already, he wouldn't have been marrying into the line of Mary's people, which is one popular theory among scholars, myself included, for explaining the differences in Luke's and Matthew's family records from David down to Jesus.
So your personal perspective, would you side more with the Catholic or the Protestant?
In the sense of whether Mary had more children after Jesus? I know the ancient tradition is that she didn't, but I understand the ancient tradition is that she didn't, and you know they were in a position to know a lot more about that. I don't have any problem with her having had more children after Jesus. I don't have any theological problem with that. The texts themselves, as far as they go on the face of it, read that way. But they don't explicitly read that way.
I'll just say this real briefly. In seeing Christ's action on the cross, that he consigns, sonship to John, rather than say Jude, for example, or James. That seems to be rather significant. But I don't know. I'm like you. I don't have a horse in this race. I just thought, I'd touch on it.
Yeah, there's legitimate discussion either way on that. I'm flexible. I personally lean toward her having more children, but I understand. There's strong tradition that she didn't. So, so we'll move along now past questions on the census of Caesar Augustus and his friend Herod the Great, which are historically interesting but not relevant to the topic of salvation in the Nativity. We'll go to the family leaving Nazareth to go to David's hometown, Bethlehem, to be registered for taxation. Oh gosh, I so badly want to go into this, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail because it would be forever. But I do want to point out that the pagan emperor Julian the Apostate, who was raised as an Arian Christian and then converted back to paganism in the 300s, he was a very scholarly dude. And one of the things he did when he was writing his book against the Galileans, that's against the Christians, was he went back to the Roman records. See, all this time in the 2nd and 3rd century and the 4th century, people have been saying, yeah, there's Roman records. Jesus existed, and that's why nobody doubted that Jesus existed. There were Roman records of him existing. And you could go and get them and look them up and see various things, including apparently a report sent by Pontius Pilate back to the governor, back to the imperial service, which is what he would have to do. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be anything special, but it's something he would have to do as part of his job.
what we got to do, a lot of this is, you have a very focused presentation and there's so much things to discuss. We really ought to just have a free form broadcast where, Justin, Johnny, and a few others jump on and we just kind of suss this stuff out. Because I love the study sessions. I think, and then most people will get the most out of that. Sometimes we gotta talk it because you got a lot of little things that you'd like to pursue too.
Yeah, I know. I mean, one of his things is that he said, okay, this is where Jesus registered for the census. Jesus registered for the census because there was another census later. The big official Roman census happened in the year 8 or thereabout, and then there was another one that would have happened 8 years after that. And so he's saying Jesus registered for the census. And then he has the records on this. And so his theory is, well, yeah, if Jesus registered for the census, he couldn't be God because then that means that he'd be under the authority of Caesar, and that would be ridiculous. Which that was his argument. Which shows that he doesn't really understand God's humility very well. But he was an Arian when he was growing up, so a lot of Arians do understand God's humility. I don't want to knock them, but he was an emperor. He had some problems. He had some arrogance problems. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, while Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem at a time when shepherds would be out with their flocks in the fields, Mary went into labor and gave birth. Luke says in Greek that there was no room in the kataluma, which doesn't totally have the connotation of an inn in our sense. It's more, well, the other ancient term for it would be a caravanserai. Yeah, in Latin, I think. That's a way station for caravans to form up or disperse. There would be no private place for a mother to give birth in a great circle of tents. And in a house, because he has relatives there in Bethlehem, if he's doing it in a house, doing so would necessarily defile the home, which wouldn't necessarily be all that much of a problem unless there was a feast of some sort about to happen. This adds a bit more weight to the idea of the birth happening at a feast time. Giving birth in a manger solves privacy and kosher problems. Traditionally, this has been thought to be in a cave, also traditionally thought to be the cave where King David hid from his enemies before becoming king, which is plausible in theory. And again, there's a huge amount of tradition that we know where the cave is, and there's a thing that's built over it. That doesn't mean that family would not move quickly within a day or two or a week or two to a house, especially with Joseph's family around. I mean, they would give birth, and once that was safe and gone, then they would move out of the cave or the manger into the house. And the house might be very nearby. I mean, relatively it's going to be nearby. Nazareth's not all that big. I mean, excuse me, Bethlehem's not all that big, so it's going to be close. Or alternately, the manger itself could have easily been inside a house in a typical arrangement for the time and place. You have the smaller herd animals, or one of the larger ones, are kept in a stable adjacent to but lower than the main floor of the house, where your leavings can be swept off. You have straw and stuff spread on the ground to catch food and other trash, and then you sweep that off into the manger. Okay. So there are plenty of options, none of which require Matthew's Magi to show up 2 years later, although not likely on the same night. That's, again, it's an historical aside, but a quicker one than hashing out census theories and other stuff we're doing. In the same region, shepherds are out keeping watch over their flocks by night, making sure nobody steals them, when an angel of the Lord blasts into view. Again, this has to be something that frightens them horribly. It's also something that, in a way, non-Christian rabbis have also been expecting, since traditionally, the birth of the King Messiah in Bethlehem was expected to be seen and announced from a watchtower for shepherds guarding sheep. The angel brings them good news, literally, he's evangelizing them, of a great joy, which shall be to the entire people, panti lao. He tells them to find Christ the Lord, born this day in the city of David, lying swaddled in a manger. The Greek verb for wrapping a baby there is where we seem to get the English word asparagus from, by the way. Suddenly, many of the heavenly army come together with the messenger, and they start a royal cheer. Glory among the highest ones, and on the earth to God. Peace among men of his delight. This 14th verse of the 2nd chapter of Gospel Luke is frankly kind of hard to translate. The classic English translation works well enough. Glory to God in the highest, period, and on earth, peace, goodwill to men. Strictly speaking, though, the Greek could read several things. Does highest
Wasn't that a
mean...
quotation from Isaiah, I thought?
No, 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 no. No, it's
Oh,
not.
okay.
That's a good question. I thought when I wondered that too when I was looking around. It really isn't.
I never looked into it. I thought that I had heard that there. Oh, thank you, honey.
Yeah. Does highest mean that glory is given among the highest angels to God, or is the highest glory being given to God? Grammatically, that would be, it could go either way. And in principle, both, of course, would be true. Is the glory being also given to God upon the earth, or more strictly speaking, the land? And if so, is the glory on the land, or is God upon the land as well as in heaven? Either or both could be true grammatically. And if the incarnation is true, all of that would be true. See the various ways that you can translate it? They're all basically true. They're all basically true if the incarnation is true.
Right.
Especially if the incarnation of God's glory, the Shekinah, is true. Now God's glory is upon the earth. And notice that God's glory still surrounds the heavenly armies and the freaking out shepherds. It's not just on the earth incarnate. God, I mean, it's not like Jesus left heaven and stopped being God, stopped being the Shekinah of God. That's still going on. And also he's being born as a baby. So, is peace on the land, or is peace in men? Grammatically, it could go either way, and either or both could and should be true. Is it peace and or delight in men? In is Greek, it's basically in, same thing as ours. And does in mean in men or among men? Like within men, like peace in me, or is it peace among you and me? Either or both could and should be true. But there is also a text transmission problem toward the end. The vast majority of Gospel copies read delight as a singular noun, nominative case, like the subject of a sentence. But the more difficult reading, which is also the best supported among the earliest existent textual copies, both in the East and the West, is of his delight. That's a singular possessive prepositional phrase. Okay. If the well-attested later reading is true, the one where it's a noun, and it's then like a noun of a subject, which has its own grammatic difficulties due to being a subject noun sticking out by itself at the end of the announcement, then the declaration would be peace and delight among or in men. If the well-attested older reading is in fact correct, which is the direction pointed to by textual criticism principles, the grammatic options shift a bit. It must be peace in men, as well as maybe on the land, whereas the delight belongs to God. Indeed, the word there in either form means good glory or even good praise, though it can also mean happiness and joy, as the term sometimes used elsewhere in the New Testament. If that older reading is true, however, then the peace would be among men who delight God, which surely isn't false as a hope, but what kind of good news would that be for all the people? I've been talking about why it would be still good news for all the people throughout this chapter already, but I'll have to come back to that question later. Meanwhile, the shepherds who are treated as unclean... See, the reason we have to come back to that question later is because if it's just peace is supposed to be to the people who already delight God, how is that a salvation of sinners from sin? All that's happening is God's own allies are being saved, the people who are already loyal. That's not unimportant, but that's not good news for everybody, and it's not a salvation of his people from their sins.
You know, Jason, you have such a funny way of making a passage that looks very straightforward on its head out to be this cryptic, like I need a decoder ring.
I don't mean to make it. I don't mean to make it cryptic. It's just in the Greek. There's different. This is why there's different translations in the Greek. When you look at an English Bible, some of them say one thing, and a lot of them say one thing, but other ones say something else. It's not that there's a conspiracy or something. It's just the grammar can go different ways.
Right. And this is why I reject perspicuity out of hand. It just seems like, wow, it's how could you ever think that?
You know, it's some perspicuity. I was having a discussion about this with a skeptic.
The way I think about it really briefly, the way I think about it is, you know, God gave us baby steps, and you see it incrementally. That,
Yeah.
he starts with a very primitive religion, and then it gets a degree of sophistication, and then more sophistication, more. And we're at the point right now that, yeah, you start with the Bible as it is, and that's good. It's going to give you the deepest wisdom you're
Yeah.
ever going to come to. But if you really want to understand what's going on and what to do with it in your own life, you got to dig, man. You got to dig hard.
Yeah, I was talking with a skeptic the other day, and he's one of these people who apparently he was super fundamentalist, and then he discovered that there are these little problems with the Bible here and there, and it just blew his mind. And I was like, oh God, that means God can't be real anymore. And he may be actually using that as an excuse now.
Geez, the difference between the uncial and the minuscule text alone, and what happens with the marginal note should be enough to make someone stop and scratch their head, especially when it comes to passages
I have actually seen somebody kind of lose their faith doing that, looking into that stuff. That doesn't, I don't understand that, but it's just because people are told by preachers on the pulpit, kind of incautiously, they'll sit there and thum their Bible down and say, all God's word or not at all God's word, thum.
Right. And especially the King James only.
Yeah, that's, and when it happened, I've seen it happen even without the King James only person. But,
right.
But when that happens, well, people who believe that, and then they run into problems in the text, even if the problems are totally trivial, or they're looking at the Greek, like, well, the Greek could be interpreted this way, or it could be interpreted that way.
Yeah, the temptation, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, the temptation is to eventually come to a certain textual nihilism, where you feel like you can't ever really know what the text says.
And this guy was like, I don't know why God would ever be garbling their transmission all the time. But it's not
right, and that's why I think what you're doing
that's
is so
overreaching.
important.
It's not garbled.
Right, but that's why I think what you're doing is so important. I hope that on this show itself, we're trying to demonstrate that there is a methodology to it, that there is a code, but it's a necessary code in order to be accurate, to convey it through the ages, and it's there if you search
and to work for different people at different times in different ways, not totally different ways,
right?
But if when you have a group of people who are barely able to bring themselves morally to do such and such, you can set up that they're not supposed to do this and this, but practically speaking, they're still going to go ahead and do it. So you better regulate it until such time as they get out of it.
Like the writ of divorce,
like slavery, for example. Yeah. So that's, God puts in laws and says, okay, you got to free all your slaves in 7 years. And if they want to stay, they can stay, but you've got to treat them better and do this and this and that for them. But every 49 years, even if they don't want to stay, you've got to free them. How often was that kept? Never!
Never,
as far as I know. But, and so, of course, you have all these regulations about slaves.
Had that written into our Constitution? Can you imagine if we had that written into our Constitution that every 49 years, all debts would be forgiven? It would be like, no, not going to happen.
Right, yeah. Yeah, right. It went beyond slavery, but it included slavery. Yeah. So also, I know there are Universalists who love to get into the Jubilee thing there, and I want to study more of that myself. I haven't gotten into it a lot. You would think, well, man, I must be really into that. I kind of am, but I just haven't gotten into it a lot yet. It's just too many other things.
Thing. I mean, you're pinpointed on where you're going, and God will take you there eventually. I have
eventually I'll get there. But there's other people who have done more work on that than I am, and you should look around for it. It's pretty interesting. So, okay.
I think Gary Emerald is one, actually. Now,
yes, yes, that's right. Gary Emerald is one. Okay, so meanwhile, the shepherds, who are treated as unclean social outcasts culturally in that time and place, but have been given this incredible message by the armies of heaven itself, as though they were supposed to be royal ambassadors, begin recovering as the armies depart back into the sky, and they say to one another, by all means, let's go down into Bethlehem and see this outpouring. In Greek is how Luke translates what they're saying. This outpouring, this gush effect, which has happened, and which the Lord has made known to us. And hurrying down from the hills, they find the baby and Joseph and Mary still in the manger. So they go out praising the glory of God for everything that they had seen and heard, just as had been told to them, and proclaiming to everyone what they had heard declared about this little boy, amazing and confusing the people who had heard what they said, which, if this was happening at the start of a feast, would include people around the temple in Jerusalem, for these shepherds would very soon be delivering animals from their flocks to be sacrificed there. perhaps for the Feast of Atonement too. See, if previously in the previous episode I was saying, yeah, this all actually kind of points toward the Feast of Tabernacles being when Jesus was born. But Mary, says St. Luke, preserved all these declarations, pondering them in her heart, which is a formal way of him signaling that he got this account from Mary herself, or possibly from someone she confided her heart to later.
I heard someone say that a better translation would be she treasured them in her heart. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a connotation. Sure. Yeah, she treasured them, but there's a word in there that she was. The connotation involved is that you're treasuring something in a way of not just of actively valuing them. Okay. Mm-hmm. and examining them and looking them over and appreciating them. That's
meditating.
Meditating, yeah, but positively valuing stuff. It's actually a really interesting word that would be great to do a word study on, and going around in the New Testament and maybe the Old Testament Greek. Right. After 8 days, Jesus is circumcised and formally named Jesus at that time, says Luke. If I'm right about the birth being on sundown at the start of the Feast of Tabernacles, this would be on the immediately subsequent Feast of Atonement. After this, Mary would no longer be ritually unclean exactly, but would still not be allowed to touch anything holy or enter the temple for another 33 days. At that time, when her purification days were completed from the birthing blood, the family brought Jesus up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, according to the precepts delivered in the books of Exodus and Numbers, that every firstborn son opening up the mother shall be declared holy to the Lord. Also, they gave a sacrifice for thanks and sin atonement, according to the declared law in Leviticus. I've got to stop for just a second and take a snort because my drainage is going.
Yeah, okay. It's super dry here. I've been waking up with like crusty everything every morning. It's like one of those winters.
I wish I was dry. It's just allergies and stuff.
Now, yeah, I get.
Now, Luke says there was a man named Simeon in Jerusalem, a man of fairness and devotion, waiting for the consolation of Israel, since they were still more or less in exile, living under Roman occupation. And the Spirit of the Holy One had alerted him, as of a secret, that he would not see death before he saw the Lord's Messiah. So into the temple he came within the Spirit. Possibly this is intended to be Simeon ben Hillel, Simeon the son of Hillel, father of Gamaliel I. The Hillel branch of Phariseeism was more amenable to spiritualizing the keeping of the law and less amenable to formal halakha, the traditional teachings obligatory to keeping the law. They would have been more inclined to promote Haggadah, the informal teachings intended as an aid to keeping the law. The family and school of Hillel was suspected for centuries afterward of having secret Christians among them. Saul of Tarsus, later known as the Christian apostle Paul, of course, was reported in Acts to have learned his formal Phariseeism from Gamaliel I, and this is the same Sanhedrin member also found in Acts cautioning some moderation in handling Peter and the apostles. His grandson, Gamaliel II, is largely credited for rescuing and restructuring rabbinic Judaism after the fall of the temple in 70 CE. At any rate, whoever this Simeon may have been, as Joseph and Mary are bringing in the baby Jesus in order to do for him what was the custom of the law, Simeon, and perhaps acting as their priest for this ritual, receives him into his arms, and blessing God, he says, "Now you dismiss your slave in peace, O my owner, just as you said, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you are making ready to fit the face of all people, the light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel." Simeon is referring, by that light for revelation to the Gentiles, to a bunch of verses from Isaiah, some of which I've already talked about in a previous episode, others of which I'll get to in later chapters or episodes as I go along. While Joseph and Mary are marveling about the things being said about Jesus, Simeon blesses them, but to Mary he says, "Look here, this one is appointed for the fall and the rising of many in Israel, and for a sign to be opposed, and you also shall be pierced with a blade to your heart, so that the reasonings of many hearts shall be revealed." The prophetess Anna arrived at that moment, a widow from youth of the house of Asher. This is one of the lost 10 tribes whose queens were traditionally sought for the kings of Israel. a holy woman who never left the temple after she was widowed, but served there night and day with fasting and prayers. She began giving thanks to God and continued to speak of this boy to all those who were awaiting the redemption of Israel, carrying onward by implication as a prophetess herself the word given through Simeon, since now he's going to die. After this, Luke says the family returned home to Nazareth in Galilee, but Matthew has other things to say about why they went there. For somewhere around this time, Magi, great ones from the east, are arriving in Jerusalem asking, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For in the east we have seen his star and we have come to worship him." This leads into King Herod's side of the plot, and at some other time I'm just going to have to go into various historical details here about the connection between these astrologers from the East and the gifts they brought, and why they would even care about the King of the Jews, Herod's family ancestry, and Jesus's family ancestry through David and Solomon. This all ties together into a puzzle reported by Josephus in his Antiquities about why near the end of his life Herod lost his formal status as friend to Augustus Caesar for leading out a punitive military expedition to the border across the Jordan to wipe out some tribes in the area, which sounds on the face of it like Herod just doing his job. So why is there a problem with Caesar? The answer comes back to a complicated political issue which Matthew and Josephus both provide interlocking information about, and which is directly related to Matthew's account of Herod deciding to send soldiers out to slaughter all the baby boys near Bethlehem. I would just need to have an appendix or another episode for the historical theory around this, but that slaughter of the boys has its own direct relation to salvational promises, as I'll soon be discussing. Anyway, on hearing of these pagan wizards, to be blunt, asking around, Herod and Jerusalem itself are troubled, possibly also due to other things happening around that time related by Luke, and having figured out from his own sages where the Messiah was supposed to be born, which is Bethlehem, according to a prophecy in Micah concerning the judge of Israel being smote on the cheek with a rod, and several other interesting messianic prophecies, some of which are highly militaristic, Herod directs the Magi on their way with a request to report back if they find him. And they do find him, now living in a house, which, as I said before, would happen very quickly in any case. The family isn't going to spend 2 years living in a manger. And having worshipped him and presenting their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, the wise men are warned in a dream by an angel to leave by another route and not to alert Herod.
So wait.
Yeah?
Do you think that Herod was a believer, but not in a salvific sense? Do you think that he really believed the prophecies and was looking to overcome them?
I don't think he necessarily believed the prophecies, but here's a group of people who are coming in. They've seen some kind of constellational arrangement in the sky. There's a really interesting theory about how John later describes this constellation arrangement when he's talking about the birth of Jesus in Rev John, which is highly interesting. I can't get into it. So they've seen this thing. They know that a king of the Jews is going to be born. They have reasons for being, oh gosh, if I could, I would just bird dog off
Herod
horribly. They have specific reasons because they come from Sabea. They come from Sheba. Okay, they have specific reasons for that. That's why their gifts are gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Those things are all found in Sabea, especially the myrrh. And there are tribes there in Bedouins today who claim they're related to Jesus and that they sent these magi to go see him. Okay, they're claiming they're related to Jesus because they're claiming they're related to Solomon and to David. And this is a huge political thing about what's going on in that area of the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. And why when the Muslims started going there,
at the very least, it seems as though Herod had an understanding of the power of a legend.
He had understanding that these people were coming in, and see, he had been, his mom, I can't remember which one is which. One of his parents was an Edomian. He's from Edom. Okay, he's Esau's descendant. The other parent was from Arabia. Okay, where these people are coming from, and that's how he got his job. He can't technically be king. Caesar Augustus was coming through on a land march to go fight Mark Antony and Cleopatra in Egypt. Okay. And he didn't want it. He wanted to be able to. He was putting down various rebellions after Julius Caesar died, and trying to consolidate his rule. So that's why he chose the land route rather than going straight over water. But to do this, he had to go through. He had to march through Israel And so he had to, at that time, the Israelis had thrown off the Greek tyranny, and they were being ruled not by a king, but by the priest, the Hasmonean dynasty. And so he's moving through there, and he needs to be able, it's not that Israel is giving him problems exactly, but the people who are living off to the east of them are raiders, okay? And they'll come in and raid things all the time. And now he's going to have, most of the time he wouldn't care about that, but now he's got this huge army with its logistic train moving through Israel. He's got to have somebody who can secure Israel for him to make sure he has a logistic train. So Herod comes up, and he's like, okay, look, there is no king. They're not going to accept anybody as a king in Israel. You need a king in Israel. And Augustus is like, yeah, obviously I do. And he says, look, they're not going to accept anybody who's not a son of David. So, but there are no sons of David who are legitimately ready to take the throne. But over in Arabia, my parents' family, they had, due to this situation that happened back in David's day, some of which we'll be talking about later, they have a claim on the throne, okay, through the Queen of Sheba, who came to visit Solomon and came back with his baby. We have a claim on the throne. I can sell this. I mean, it's better than nothing. So if you promote
Palestine originally called Westeros at some point? I said, was Palestine originally called Westeros at some point?
Oh no, I never heard of that. That's a good question. That sounds great, though. No, I've never heard of that.
You haven't watched
Palestine comes from a Roman word that means Philistine. It was their way of making fun of the.
I just told a joke. That was the only person watching this that didn't get it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I don't actually watch the Game of Thrones.
Hey, it doesn't happen often. I'll exalt it.
Okay. But yeah, there's a lot of political family drama going on here. So he said, all right, look, I can sell this. I will marry a Hasmonean princess. I'll consolidate the line, and Herod the Great, I'll take over as king. And then we'll be good buddies. That's how he got to be a friend of Caesar. He helped Caesar Augustus win the battle and put down his final rival and become the first Augustus Caesar. All the Caesars were really named Augustus, but he was the first one. His real name was Octavian or something. So now they're a friend of Caesar's, and so he's got a situation. Herod's got a situation now, however, of where the Romans aren't occupying Israel at the moment, but the people don't really like the fact that his connection to being a son of David is really tenuous and kind of disreputable. And he's half Edomite, a son of Esau. And these people are just crazy raiders that are crossing over and causing trouble all the time. And that's part of his job, is that he has family connections there and he can keep them from doing that. And if they do that, then he'll go out and smack them. So, oh gosh, I told you we should not go down this rabbit hole because it's really cool, but it doesn't. In the story, so it's like, okay, so now he's got this prophecy coming from these other people who are basically his family relatives, and they're coming in and saying, a real son of David has been born. We've seen the star in the sky. He's going to be born. And he's got this other rumors coming around from Bethlehem now, where these people are coming in and talking about this, and you've got prophets in the temple talking about it. Well, whether or not anybody was actually born there, he's late in his life. He's going crazy from old age. He's already had some of his sons killed. He's had his favorite wife killed out of suspicion of treachery. There's actually a saying in Rome about him, making fun of him, that it's safer to be a pig in his house because he's not going to eat a pig than it is to be his own son. Wow. So he's looking. He hears this and it's like, yeah, just to be safe, I'm gonna kill every boy in that village. But who does he send?
First century version of Planned Parenthood.
Yeah. Well, so who's he going to send to do this? His reputation's already kind of in the toilet, but he's going to start a rebellion if he sends his own troops to do it. And God knows he's going to start a rebellion if he sends Roman troops to do it. So who does he send to go do it? Well, the Bible doesn't say. But it leaves open this question, okay? Josephus, meanwhile, says that he was a friend of Caesar, but he lost the title because he went out and attacked these tribes over on the border that he was supposed to be taking care of. But that sounds like he's doing his job. So why was Caesar upset about this? Why would he even be upset about this? When you put both of those together, what happens is you have a caravan coming in, as usual, to do its trade from his home area, and he gets with the caravan. He says, look, why don't y'all just hit Bethlehem on your way out? And y'all can do the raid. Y'all can do this raid on Bethlehem. I hear there's some good loot there. I kind of need to have it done. You can keep it over whatever loot you want, whatever thing found, but here's the deal. You need to make sure you kill any kids, because we have a good deal going here. And if people get this idea that there's a king being born in Bethlehem who has a better claim to the throne than I have, it's just going to be endless trouble. There's not going to be a lot of kids there anyway, probably. But as you go in there and do a raid on it, make sure that you kill all the little boys, 2 years and younger, just to be safe.
So what is it about that put him on the outs with Caesar? Because
that in itself
tactics were not
no. That in itself wouldn't. But Bethlehem is not just on the border. Bethlehem is kind of a suburb of Jerusalem. It's not that far away. So when you have, so now what gets him into trouble is, so they come down, they do their little raid. Okay, nobody attaches it to Herod. Exactly. It's not on his orders. Okay, but he gets the job done as far as he's concerned. And then they go on their merry way back over the River Jordan into their territory. Okay, well, now he's got to go do a punitive expedition against them. He had promised them he wouldn't, but now in order to make nice with Caesar, he's got to go do that. But he really shouldn't have had to go. He should have been doing his job and keeping them peace. This is a major raid. If this is a raid, this isn't just them going over the border and hitting a little border town. This is them going halfway into Israel. That looks suspicious and weird. So at least it means he's not doing his job. His job is to keep raiders from hitting the Roman supply lines overland going into Egypt. If they're getting that close to Jerusalem, he's not doing his job.
Right.
So he rides out and goes out over there and whacks all their tribe.
Sounds like
it gets rid of the witnesses.
Clinton getting caught uranium-1 almost.
Yeah. No, the what?
Come on, you got to see the parallel there.
Yeah, I didn't hear it.
Oh, it's kind of like Hillary Clinton getting caught with uranium-1.
Oh yeah. Right. Whoops, I was selling that to the Chinese.
Yeah.
Oh, now the North Koreans have nukes. How did that happen?
Oops.
So, oops, how did they get that technology? Oh, we specifically said that we were going to make all the security around that looser so that the world would be safer for everyone to have nukes.
And all this proves is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. It happened in the first century, still happens till today.
So when when Caesar hears about this line, that's why Herod loses the title friend of Caesar. Now he's got to go out and kick ass and stop that problem. And apparently it works, because Josephus says that before he dies, he does in fact get the title. He does get his friendship with Caesar back. I don't remember he gets the actual title, the formal title, friend of Caesar, back, but he does make friends with Caesar again before he dies.
Right. And very briefly, what was this Herod's relationship to the Herod that we see beheading John the Baptist?
The Herod beheading John the Baptist is one of his sons. After Herod the Great dies, there's Archelaus and Antipater and some other people that are his sons. Actually, Philip the Tetrarch, was really a really nice guy. He was the king of some territory on the other side of the Jordan, north of Lake Galilee, where Jesus spent some time also. And it really is a lot like the Game of Thrones when you think about it. It is, yes, it is. All of history is like Game of Thrones, and it
is crazy. I mean, the thing is, it would be nice to see more like dramas made about this time, because that's what's going to help people read the Bible, is being able to see what the culture was really like.
Yeah, it's absolute Game of Thrones stuff. Yeah, so including with occasional fantasy miracles thrown in, except they're real. But there are no dragons. Well, there are dragons, but they're way back in the Old Testament time, and they don't breathe fire a whole lot. So they're just dinosaurs.
You're going Ken Ham on me, buddy.
Man, that's how things work out.
I'm leaving it alone. I ain't touching it.
That's
I ain't
how
touching
the
it.
texts work out, and that's how the local traditions work out. And oh my gosh, there's a mosaic from the 3rd or 4th century. I saw it in a Reader's Digest thing of the Holy Land. They didn't even realize what they were looking at when they took this photograph. There's a mosaic of the story of Jonah. Okay. And he's just been spit out by the whale, and he's on the beach, and he's heading off to Nineveh. Only it's not a whale. It is literally the Loch Ness monster.
Plesiosaur.
Yes, it is a plesiosaur, and it's got little horns on its head. Okay, but they're not horns; they're blowholes, and he's spouting. Okay, really? That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing. Why would they even think to put that in there? It's because they've seen it.
The only thing I will say about this very briefly, there is no problem with prehistoric animals, especially aquatic ones, surviving to modern times.
Right.
Because
we have lots of prehistoric animals that survive to modern times, even if evolution is...
The only time we come up with enough fossils to actually find enough of them is during some mass extinction event, through which...
Right, where they've all been swept into this jumbled higgledy-piggledy. There's whole islands I've read up in Siberia where you can't really get to them very well. But these islands are just made of fossil bones. It's crazy. And hopefully one of these days, with the world warms up enough and relations improve enough, that people can be sent, scientific teams can be sent out there and study that, which is amazing fossil finds. But anyway, okay, so back to the actual topic at hand. This is
I'm trying, man.
The thing with the slaughter of the innocents, though, does have some bearing about what's going on here.
Right.
All right. Joseph is also warned in a dream to escape, and he takes the family over the Egyptian border, presumably to a long-established Jewish settlement near the mouth of the Nile, which would either develop their own temple eventually or was already doing so by now due to the illegitimacy of Herod's temple. Matthew says that this was to fulfill the prophecy from Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt did I call my son. That's a highly interesting claim for our purposes, because Hosea isn't prophesying at all there about God calling any kind of Messiah out of Egypt. Although no doubt Matthew is appealing to a well-known Jewish belief that the King Messiah will not only fulfill all remaining prophecies, but will do perfectly and again what Israel has already done and badly. And also that all prophecies will be fulfilled even more fully again for a second or third time in the day of Jehovah to come. What God is actually prophesying about there in Hosea is something that doesn't seem at first to have anything to do with the Nativity story. The whole scroll of Hosea, an alternate form of Joshua, by the way, is thick with denunciations and rejections of mercy upon Israel, who, for example, in chapter 2, has an adulteress for a mother, not the wife of God, and whose children are thus illegitimate children of whoredoms. God declares in Hosea chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, that he shall have no more mercy upon the house of Israel, but shall utterly take them away, for they are not his people, and he shall not be their God. And yet, after continuing on into what we now call chapter 2, with dreadful promises along this line, God shifts in that same prophecy to promising amazing mercy to the same rebel people after all, using the figure of a rejected wife, received again after a long time. And after going back to her husband, once she realizes how worthless her adultery is, and betrothed anew forever in righteousness and in justice, or in judgment, and in loving kindness or mercy, and in compassion and in faithfulness. God will thus have compassion on her who had not even obtained compassion, and will say to those who are not his people, you are my people. And they shall no longer call God my Baal, my Lord, but my husband. St. Paul takes these famous promises and applies them similarly even further to the Gentiles. This doesn't end God's denunciation of Israel's sins, because that reconciliation is in the future and they're in trouble now, so he keeps on going through the Hosea. But like many prophets, Hosea is inspired back and forth between the punitive destruction and salvational mercy on those whom God has destroyed. This continues in Hosea 11, which is primarily about God complaining over Israel's treacherous ingratitude after being called as God's son out of Egypt. That's what Matthew is quoting. It isn't about God calling the Messiah to Israel out of Egypt, much less about the high Christology of God calling his only begotten Son as the Messiah from there. It isn't about Christology at all. It's about God complaining that rebel Israel, whom he regards as his own son Ephraim and saved out of Egypt, is an ungrateful and treacherous oppressor and killer of innocents. Therefore, God promises to send Assyria in to slay Ephraim. And yet, in the same chapter, God also promises to have mercy on Ephraim and to restore him somehow after punishment. That's the salvational prophecy of Hosea 11. After similar denunciations and warnings of destruction through Hosea 12, Jehovah calls death and Sheol to come destroy rebel Israel in Hosea 13. But in Hosea 14, destroyed rebel Israel afterward repents and is restored to fellowship by Jehovah. St. Paul will quote the calling of death and Sheol down on rebel Israel at the end of 1 Corinthians 15. That's the big chapter on resurrection. As part of his reassurance to fellow Christians to keep our evangelical efforts in assurance that our work will not be in vain, but shall be fulfilled in the resurrection to come. But why would he quote death and Hades or Sheol being sent out to destroy Israel as evidence of our evangelical work not being in vain thanks to the resurrection? Paul, who wouldn't see chapter numbers, must be looking ahead to the resurrection and salvation of rebel Israel, because he rephrases the quote as a taunt against death thanks to the victory of resurrection in God. I'll have to get back to that in a much, much, much later episode when we finally start doing Paul. But there are connections further to here in the Nativity story, which we'll be getting to soon. Why would Matthew even think about Hosea 11 in this context? He has a reason related to the virgin birth, but it takes some more unpacking. When reporting the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem, who by then might amount to only a handful of toddlers and infants, Bethlehem being a small town when not serving as a shepherd post at feast time, but naturally the murders would be traumatic to the mothers and to their people regardless of the numbers. Matthew explains that this fulfills a prophecy by Jeremiah, quoting Jeremiah 31. A sound in Ramah is heard, lamentation and much anguish, Rachel lamenting her children, and she would not be comforted, for they are not. If Jeremiah 31 sounds familiar, it should. I was talking about the two subsequent chapters already in relation to parts of the Nativity story last time. Also, I've talked about Jeremiah 31 back in my episode on Jesus' explanation for the purpose of raising those who do the evil things to our resurrection of judgment. And I can be connecting that point again soon.
Was that where it says that God did not create the world to be formless and void, but to be inhabited?
I think that's in Isaiah.
Okay.
But it might be in Jeremiah 31. I didn't notice it and put a note down, but it might be there. I'm not saying it's not. I just don't have it in front of me right now. So.
It's ringing a bell. It jumped out to me.
There's a promise about that I know in Isaiah, that God has not created the earth to be waste and nothing. So even though he's destroying all this stuff, he is going to bring it back. So, okay. So once you realize that Ramah is an area near Bethlehem, it's a little plain near Bethlehem, that first might sound very impressive as a prophecy for the slaughter of innocent children. But there's a big problem, and it's a big problem related to Hosea 11. That verse in Jeremiah 31 and its surrounding prophecy has less than nothing to do with mourning over innocent children slain unjustly by a murderer. In fact, there's nothing in that prophecy specifically about the coming Messiah either. Instead, that particular verse is about righteous Israel, poetically typified by Rachel, the wife of the patriarch Jacob, wailing in lamentation and anguish over the deaths of her rebel children slain in their sins by God in the day of the Lord to come.
Hello.
Now, one could argue...
That's something there.
Yeah, that's unexpected, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
You weren't expecting that. Wait a minute.
The title I kind of was, but I never saw that before. I never noticed that before, obviously.
Now, one could argue that even this vastly huge difference might be par enough for the course by the standards of Jewish midrash commentary. They're likely to just take a verse, like totally proof text the verse. They'll just take a verse, and because it sounds cool, they'll come up with something else. But on the other hand, vastly huge differences of this sort are why most Christians and most non-Christians don't have a particularly high opinion of rabbinic midrashing. They just take a verse that sounds cool and spring this whole stuff out of it. Before going into a discussion about what's happening in Jeremiah 31st, let me pause a moment to point out that Matthew's appeal to this prophecy, and there is an actual prophecy involved that has something to do with the Nativity, as we'll soon see, lends considerable strength to a standard argument of this slaughter being a historical event. It's very popular among anti-Christian apologists to try to argue that Luke and Matthew invented the Bethlehem stories in order to fit a prophecy that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem, not from Nazareth, a concept that even John's Gospel seems embarrassed about. Why is he coming from Nazareth? And nothing good ever comes from Nazareth. This in itself would be strong internal evidence that Jesus not only existed, but at least grew up in Nazareth, thus also that Nazareth existed in some apparently insignificant form in those days. But Matthew was inventing material to bolster, if Matthew was inventing material to bolster prophecies, he would have at least referenced the actual connection to Jeremiah 31st to a virgin birth. See, there's going to be a connection later about this. He wouldn't invent a slaughter of innocent children and then connect that as the fulfillment of a prophecy about the slaughter of wicked adults, much less then ignore the actual virgin birth connection, which we haven't gotten to yet. We're going to get to it later. It makes more sense for Matthew to be receiving the story as history and then being inspired to see an oblique connection to this prophecy in the wailing of local mothers over slain children, because Ramah was a plain nearby where the Assyrians gathered up their Jewish prisoners from the region to march them into captivity. Toddlers and infants were not expected to survive, and so were mercifully, though ruthlessly, slain by the Assyrians to spare them from dying more slowly along the way. But if two slaughters are so totally different, aside from some trivial surface similarities and the very untrivial anguish of the mothers, why even bother drawing the connection at all as a prophetic fulfillment? One main reason, though it won't be obvious at first, is because slain rebel Israel in that prophecy isn't called Israel. Slain rebel Israel is called Ephraim. And now there's a link to Matthew's mysterious insistence on Hosea 11 being fulfilled by Jesus going to Egypt. But again, the connection won't be obvious yet. Again, while there was apparently a popular expectation, simply proof texting that verse perhaps, that the King Messiah would, like a new Moses, come from Egypt somehow, which is why a messianic pretender called the Egyptian shows up and tries to start a revolution against Rome in the 1st century around the time of Jesus. Rabbis in the Talmud sure were not impressed later by the notion Jesus came from Egypt. They attribute his miraculous power to pagan magic learned there instead. While the rabbis in their commentaries later didn't much like this idea of the Messiah coming from Egypt, they did very much like the idea of Jeremiah 31, combined with what we now call Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1, the verse we looked at earlier about punished Israel dwelling in the shadow of death until the light of the coming Messiah shines on them. They think that those two things put together testify to God somehow saving all of Israel, living and dead, from their sins and restoring them to faithfulness. In Alfred Edersheim's mammoth compilation of Jewish and rabbinic history surrounding the life and times of Jesus the Messiah, which is the name of that tome, he reports that their interpretation regarded this as being done through the suffering of the Messiah, rejected by 140 nations, including in bearing the sins of Israel. Now, I find that interesting because even to my Christian eye, the Messiah per se seems nowhere in view in Jeremiah 31. But the rabbis very peculiarly interpreted rebel Ephraim, slain in his sins by God, as the righteous Messiah, thereby finding, I would say placing, the King Messiah in this passage. They at least do not regard Ephraim as righteous Israel, so they're not putting themselves in the place of their own positive interpretation of Ephraim. But they do regard him specifically as a figure of the King Messiah to come. How they treat the apparent repentance and consequent restoration of Ephraim, if they notice that at all, is not reported by Edersheim. The theme of rebellion and punishment for Ephraim seems to be folded by the rabbis into the concept of the sins and rebellions of others being borne voluntarily by the Messiah at the request of God, who, in a colorful touch on their commentaries on this verse, promises that Messiah only has to bear such a burden for a year, until the Day of Atonement, see, while also reassuring the Messiah that if he finds the burden onerous at any time, God will remove it at once. To which the Messiah answers that he gladly bears it for the sake of all Israel, living and dead. That's in the rabbinic commentaries on Jeremiah 31, connected to Isaiah 9:1, where Israel is being brought out of the shadow of death. See? So why this focus in the prophets on Ephraim as rebel Israel? We saw this in an earlier chapter discussing Ezekiel and the salvation of Sodom too. They're talking about Ephraim as rebel Israel. Because
hold on a second, really quick. Now, my understanding of modern Judaism is they interpret messianic passages to be referring to Israel as a whole. And I mean, maybe I'm just.
It depends. Ahead. It depends on the rabbi, basically. Do they really do they expect an actual King Messiah to show up and return? Not to return, but to show up and lead Israel? Some of them do, and some of them don't. But you are correct about there being a long tradition here of the Messiah language in the scriptures referring to Israel corporately, that Israel is the beloved son. I mean, there's direct statements about that in the scriptures too. So that's not a wrong way to look down it. That is another level of it. Some rabbis have said, okay, well, there just is no King Messiah ever coming. If he was going to come, he would have come back at the time of Christ. So, and obviously he didn't come, right? So he's just never going to come. And so these things are all to be interpreted as regarding Israel corporately. And hey, Israel is now back in Israel as a nation. Yay. But there's more prophecies to come on that. And so that's kind of how they go. But there's variations. So,
yep.
If there's Orthodox and there's conservative and there's the really liberal Reform Jews, and they all have variations between them. So it's like Christianity. There's different ways of interpreting how the prophecies work out. Is there really going to be a millennium kingdom? Is it figurative? What does it mean? Okay, so why is Ephraim this name for an area in Israel that's named after one of Joseph's kids, by the way? It's part of Joseph's inheritance area. Why is Ephraim being used in these prophecies as a description for rebel Israel being slain? Well, I think historically, there was a beloved rebel son of Israel who died in the forests of Ephraim once upon a time. That's the story of King David's son Absalom, which I won't fully go into because that's another rabbit trail. It has lots of interesting topics, such as whether and how far God preordains evil, and also rebel prophets of God. Also a lot of family and political drama going back to the conception and death of David's first son by his adultery with the ambassadorial daughter of Sheba, wife of his great friend and military general Uriah. And this also connects back in with Solomon being the daughter of Sheba, being the son of the daughter of Sheba, Bathsheba, and this connection to Arabia now that they have a claim on the kingship of Israel. Even in some medieval times, there was actually a Jewish kingdom down in what we call Yemen now. There was a point where they were even killing Christians at one point, and the emperor in Byzantine emperor tried to get the Christians in Ethiopia to go over and try to put a stop to that. There's lots of cool stuff going on there. Anyway, for our purposes, the story can pick up with David choosing to retreat from Jerusalem rather than to fight his son Absalom for it, who has rebelled against his father because he thought wrongly, but not unreasonably under the circumstances, that David meant to have him killed. Again, there's a long and sad family drama story there, very Game of Thrones-ish, based on a poor diplomatic stance by David, but it never even entered his mind to hurt Absalom. Consequently, in seeing this rebellion as his long-awaited punishment for betraying his friend and ally Uriah to death and stealing his wife, David withdraws his very confused army who wants to fight to Jericho, or rather to a fortress past Jericho, without a fight. Goaded by an evil high priest who was nevertheless a legitimate prophet of God, and yeah, that sort of thing happened, Absalom took a very hardline stand to signal he would not be negotiating for peace with his father. David could either abdicate or fight. Is exactly what he did. David has a harem of wives and concubines. Okay, and Absalom basically says they're now his, and he demonstrates it very publicly. We won't go into details about that. It's really bad. Even then, David refuses to fight. and instructs his troops to go easy on his son if they get a chance, which they do, because Absalom realizes David hasn't abdicated, and so, figuring David will naturally raise popular support for retaking the throne, Absalom follows after him with his own army. Interestingly, Joab, Absalom's friend, who had previously acted as a mediator for negotiating a peace between Absalom and David, is given command of a third of David's troops. David still refuses to go out and fight Absalom directly, but he won't stop his troops from defending themselves from an assault. He strictly charges Joab and the other generals, however, not to hurt Absalom. The fight goes badly for Absalom, and while riding his mule through the forests of Ephraim County, I guess you could say, during his fighting retreat, he catches his famously long and dense hair on thick tree branches, yanking him off his fleeing mule and dangling him there. One of David's soldiers finds him, but remembering David's orders, he simply goes off to report to his general, who happens to be Joab. Joab insults his soldier for not taking advantage of Absalom's vulnerability, and so he goes out himself and mortally wounds Absalom with spears, his bodyguards afterwards hacking Absalom to death, while the son of David is hanging helplessly and in wrenching pain from that tree. Now, at first, the victorious troops routing the armies of northern Israel brought down by Absalom rejoice and jump up and down, celebrating that Absalom is dead. But does David the king rejoice in this? No. Instead, his heart is entirely for his rebellious son. And when he learns that Absalom has died, he's greatly grieved. He tries to go off in private to mourn. But the people can hear him wailing, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would that I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." And the salvation of that day was turned to mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day that the king was grieved for his dead son, and they went by stealth into the city of Jericho that day, as people who are humiliated steal away when they flee in battle. That's why rebel Israel is sometimes called Ephraim, and probably why the rabbis are making a connection between Ephraim and the king Messiah to come, who is a son of David. So you have Ephraim refers to Absalom, the son of David. The king Messiah is going to be the son of David, but he's going to do perfectly, and correctly what the previous son of David did. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It's hard to find my spot sometimes. This is always a story that really affected me personally deeply, especially when you connect it with the fact that Yahweh had said that this is a man after his own heart. Mm-hmm. And when you see absolutely deplorable things that Absalom had done to David and his wives,
mm-hmm. And like, how could this guy be after God's own heart? This is basically why.
Because you're looking at the worst possible son ever, mm-hmm. and he's defeated in battle, and all he can do is be brought down to his knees, a broken man.
Yeah, and David would rather he had died instead of Absalom.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a type of Christ right there. Where
Absalom is absolutely a type of Christ, and David is a type of Christ. Yeah. So now, originally, once upon a time, I had to go through all this because I was in a dispute with some other people, and they were using Absalom as an example of a man who was driven by God to be forsaken by God, with the implication being that we should not show mercy to such a man, expecting no mercy to be shown to him by God. But David cried, "Would that I had died instead of thee." He was always trying to show mercy to Absalom. Even after he died, he was still trying to show mercy to Absalom. And centuries later, the Son of God himself, God incarnate as the Son of David, submitted to be hung on a tree, to be stabbed with a blade to the heart, mutilated by a squad of bodyguards, fulfilling in so doing and in so dying the cry of David, even more so than the rabbis who are not Christians are expecting the King Messiah to fulfill Ephraim. Okay? Certainly Christ does not do less in fulfilling all righteousness than his ancestor David, the merely human king who's a murderer and an adulterer. For the son of David hung from a tree for the sake of the son of David, who hung from a tree. If not for Absalom, then not for me either, the sinner. That's the background of calling rebel Israel Ephraim, and why God, in Hosea 11, declares he still loves Ephraim, Like David still loved Absalom. See, that's the connection. And somehow God won't kill Ephraim despite having to kill him, but will have mercy on him and restore him instead. That's why Paul, when he's looking at Hosea 11 and he's citing it as a well, Hosea 12 or 13 actually, he's citing it as evidence to the Christians, his Christians, saying, look, there's going to be a resurrection, and you keep going and do your evangelical duty. Don't worry. It will all come out. You keep going. Your work will not be in vain. And he's referring back to this. The details in Jeremiah 31st are even more pronounced. Rachel represents righteous Israel, who survives the coming of God in the day of Jehovah, with the coming defeat by the Assyrians being used as a prophetic foreshadowing of that coming time. She isn't comforted by explanations like how her children were warned they'd be zorched if they continued on, which they were warned and they continued on, so God zorched them, and they were rightly zorched because they were evil, unjust men and women, oppressors of the poor and weak, slayers of the innocent, ungrateful, treacherous. She isn't comforted that they got the punishment they deserved. She isn't saying they didn't get what they deserved, but she's sad about it. She's not being comforted by God doesn't tell her, well, they got what they deserve. That's not what comforts her. How much less would a mother be comforted that her innocent children had been slain? Would she be comforted by God telling her that her apparently innocent children were also sinners who deserved to die? That might in some way also be true, but what mother would be comforted by that? Would she be comforted by God telling her that he had never had any intention of saving her wicked children from their sins to begin with? Would she be comforted by God telling her that although he had intended to save them from their sins, their time is now forever gone because he failed to get it done in time, or other people failed to get it done, or he had only opened a door for them to walk through after all, and he had never sought to bring them through it, or he had in fact never made any provision at all to get it done for them, even though he had intended to save them too? Would such a mother be comforted by God promising to give her new children better than those worthless or innocent ones she has lost? Maybe some mothers would be comforted by one of those things, and God does promise that Rachel is going to have children that she never even knew she was going to have. But God doesn't promise any of those things in that prophecy from Jeremiah. Not to mothers wailing over the deaths of innocent children, as historically at Ramah and as historically later with Herod's murders, and not to righteous Israel grieving over her slain rebel children, refusing to be comforted because they no longer live. What he does promise Rachel in Jeremiah 31 is that he does still love his rebel son Ephraim, and he still loves his rebel daughters. He kind of moves the metaphor around some. And even though currently they are not, Ephraim will finally learn repentance and learn to do justice instead of injustice. God promises that Rachel's slain rebel children will one day be restored to her, no longer bad children, but good children instead. That's how God comforts Rachel, weeping in anguish over her slain rebel children. It's one thing to comfort someone over a lost child slain in their innocence, or their relative innocence, that they weren't bad children, and so God will one day restore them to their mothers who love them. That's true, but it doesn't help comfort the mothers of evil children. And anyway, what does it do to offset the horrible fact that God allowed evil children to murder the good children? Maybe God allowed it because he refuses to make his children into puppets, but even when they make horrible contributions to the story of history, he lets them be bad children rather than be not children at all. But if those bad children never learned to be better, then the good children were sacrificed to the bad children for nothing, for less than nothing, because it turns out God didn't love the bad children enough to keep leading them to be good children. Or maybe God never loved them at all to begin with, in which case this must all be some inscrutable plan for God to show off how powerful he is by providing himself someone to punch on for doing bad things. But if the bad children, who are even murderers, learn to do better someday, that's good news for everyone. Or it's almost good news. God sits up high and allows or fosters such tragedies for other people to suffer, the innocent suffering for the sake of the guilty. Now, that might be some other kind of theism. That might be even a non-orthodox kind of Christianity, but that isn't orthodox Christianity. We think God voluntarily suffers with the innocent too in being victimized by the guilty. We even think God Most High voluntarily suffers with the guilty while they are being rightfully punished. For if he's not voluntarily suffering with those rebel murderers on either side of the cross, then he is not voluntarily suffering with anybody. If we're right, that's the point of Emmanuel, God being with us in and as Jesus Christ. It's also something, if we're right, that undermines the one best argument of the unfaithful, that God, if he exists, is only a most powerful tyrant on high, imposing his will on those who are weaker than he is. Instead, to help bring about the restoration of rebel Ephraim, justly slain, as well as the innocents slain by the unjust, like the unjust Ephraim, Jehovah has begotten a new thing in the earth. A woman will encompass a man. That is the riddle with which God ends the particular prophecy through Jeremiah, quoted by Matthew in regard to the slaughter of innocent children by guilty children in Bethlehem. And it's probably also why Matthew was inspired to refer to this as a messianic prophecy, because on that day long ago, in historical Bethlehem, in a cave that was used as the manger stall, God did do something new in the earth as a woman encompassed a man. There was a virgin birth. Ephraim, having been slain in his sins, shall smite his thigh and repent of his sins. That's what it says in Jeremiah 31. And it is of rebel Israel that God says he loves him with an Eonian love and draws back to him with loving kindness. Now, even if you don't agree with any of my argument that this is about the resurrection and restoring of those who did the evil things, and that this resurrection and restoration shall be accomplished by Christ, who is the answer to the riddle of God doing something new in the earth in Jeremiah 31, something new involving a woman encompassing a man that has never been done before. You should be aware, or perhaps recall from back on episode 1.2, the first scriptural episode I did, that someone with vastly much more knowledge and authority on this topic than I can ever distantly approach having agrees that this prophecy, Jeremiah 31, is about the resurrection from the dead. And that person is Jesus Christ. We're reported in John chapter 6, 45. John reports Jesus connecting his dragging of all persons toward him in resurrection to verse 34 of Jeremiah 31. That all people, from the least to the greatest, shall come to Jehovah, like rebel Ephraim, slain in his sins, coming to Jehovah, to be taught by Jehovah, with Jesus identifying himself thereby as Jehovah again, by the way, notice. Does all people being dragged to Christ by the resurrection to be taught by him include those who have been unjust? Yes, for God says in Jeremiah, in bringing them to learn from him, for I will forgive their injustices, and their sin I will remember no more. Consequently, Jesus isn't talking in John 6 about raising people who will never be given to him, but about raising people who have not yet come to him, who do not yet honor the Son and the Father. But they will, from John chapter 5. He will bring them to himself, and they will be saved. Perhaps relatedly, Gehenna must be the whole valley of ashes and dead bodies included as part of the restoration of ruined Jerusalem at the end of Jeremiah 31. That's probably referring to a physical restoration of the area, but it also includes sanctification, so it cannot be merely physical in any case, and may stand for a symbol of what happens to the spiritual punishment symbolized by Gehenna. We have covered a massive amount of material in the Nativity stories, which have turned out to have unexpected connections, not only to salvation after death, but of the salvation of all sinners after death, even where they have been punished by God. As John the Baptist quotes from Isaiah 40 afterward, where Luke transitions out of his nativity account into the beginning of Jesus' ministry, preaching a baptism of repentance into the forgiveness or sending away of sins, all flesh shall see the salvation of God. In that prophecy that he's quoting, God says to his people, "Comfort, oh comfort, speak to the heart of Jerusalem and call out to her that her hard service or her warfare is ended, that her injustice has been removed or paid off, that she has received from Jehovah's hand double for all her sins." That's the start of a long sequence of consolation promises to rebel Israel, punished even to death by God. For all flesh is grass, and all its beauty or constancy is like the flower of the field. So the grass withers, the flower fades when the breath or the spirit of Jehovah blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. That's in verses 6 through 8. Thus shall all flesh together see the glory of Jehovah. That's verse 5. It is Jehovah, their Elohim himself, and no one less or other, whose way should be prepared and who is coming to save them from their sins and reconcile them to himself. The psalm of this prophecy goes very far in describing Jehovah Almighty, creator of the heavens and the earth, the everlasting Elohim, as the one alone worthy of worship, who is coming in judgment and salvation, as the good shepherd, who will tenderly care for his punished flock. Nor is this a result of sacrificial offerings or anything that humanity could do to earn such salvation, as it says. For Lebanon itself does not have enough wood to burn or beasts to burn for such an offering. And all nations are as nothing before him, regarded as nothing by him, and less than nothing and void. How then, going back to the announcement of the angel to the shepherds on that first Christmas evening, can it be good news for all the people for peace to come to those of God's delight? After all, God clearly does not delight in sin, nor in the sinner who sins. But then, who can be saved if peace only comes to those in whom God delights? A significant number of Christians and Christian theologians throughout our history would say, no, it isn't good news for all the people. It's only good news for the chosen elect of God. And there is some important theological truth in that, which they're trying to protect by saying so. It is only by the freely given joy, the grace, the charis of God, that any of us can be pleasing to God at all. Without that grace, we don't even have the ability to be good. Other Christians, myself included, would say that God gives this gracious gift to all persons everywhere, and whether or not we please God depends on what we do with our gift, rather like with the parable of the talentines or the minas in Matthew's and Luke's Gospels, respectively. We talked about that a long time ago. If we abuse the gifts of God, we can rightfully expect no peace from God, not until we stop abusing the gifts of God. In context of the Christmas gift of Christ himself, the saving action of God himself, we may consider God to be presenting us with a present that he will unwrap for us, and which God certainly made and provided for us. Rejecting that gift or trying to take advantage of that gift apart from acknowledging the grace of God and giving it is like the parable of the king who gives a wedding party for his son, inviting everyone everywhere to participate, but some refuse to come, giving poor, insulting reasons. Fair, honest reasons not to come, such as thinking oneself too poor or the king too much of an enemy to believe the offer is real, that's another matter. The king sends out special messengers to those people in the hedges and byways to practically compel them in. Whereas others come to the party but refuse to wear the celebration clothes provided graciously by the king. Those people, even though the king is friendly to them, will still be thrown outside the celebration party, where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. So we'll be getting back to that parable in the next episode. Now, some of us Christians believe that God doesn't offer the present, so to speak, to everyone, but he does persistently offer it to at least some people until they receive it. And some of us Christians believe that God does offer it to everyone, but eventually takes it away, not persistently offering it until they agree to receive it. A few Christians, myself included, think both of those other types of Christians have got things right. And so we believe God persistently offers that gift to everyone and to everyone until those persons receive it, even if God persists for unspeakable eons of the eons. But all of us Christians agree that not having this gift means missing out on the best of life himself most high. And all of us agree that refusing this gift, whether temporarily or permanently, is not good news for anyone. So there is a warning of a sword couched in the message of the heavenly armies, peace to men of God's delight. But here's some other news about that sword. The Messiah, God Most High himself, shares that sword to the heart, so that the hearts of many shall be revealed. God Most High does not baptize with spirit, even with fire from only on high, but he stoops down low in humility to count himself among the rebels, sharing the chastening with us, even allowing himself to be sacrificed and abused by us rebels when we sin. And he does that out of love for us, even when we are sinners. All of us Christians agree with this in principle, as well as to some extent, at least in practice. Even the Christians who only believe God gives himself for some, but not for all, still believe, and ardently so, that God does not wait for sinners to repent and seek forgiveness and salvation before he acts towards saving sinners from sin. The message of Christmas, as well as of Easter, is that God Most High is not a tyrant, not even a just tyrant. The highest possible power gives himself for even the worst of rebels because he loves them. And by them, I mean us, and I mean me. That was a completely new idea as a religious idea at the time. And I think I can say it's still completely unique today. The baby Jesus of the Christmas story isn't merely a lesser God being born more or less by accident. He isn't a lesser God or even God Most High in one or another way being born to help the people whom he or he with a capital H, already accounts us as allies. He isn't mere divinity coming to help whoever will listen to him to cease to be persons themselves so they can enter back into his substance. The story is about the ground and source of all reality, sacrificing his life to give life to those who are in rebellion against the ground and source of all reality. The story is about the ground and source of all reality sharing the sword to the heart with the guilty and with the innocent too, who must suffer in this valley of death, as it says in Isaiah, and separation, such as Mary would have to endure a sword to her own heart at the unjust death of her son. Even if you, wherever you are in the world today, who has managed to get this far in the episode, do not or cannot believe in the story as being factually true, at least try to understand and appreciate what the meaning of the story is. If you can even accept what's at stake when people try to put up billboards mocking the worth of this story, even as only a story at all, that's accepting the present, at least a little, to some degree. And that's a whole lot better than throwing away such a present as trash, unfit for human consumption. May you, if you are not a Christian yet, come someday to believe that love most high has come and comes to share our joy and our pain in fair togetherness with us. Freely given, you have received. Be giving, as Jesus says, freely given. And hug someone for New Year's if you can.
This is the mic. That was good. That was real good stuff. In case you're wondering, those times you see me blanking out, I'm usually doing technical stuff.
Oh, okay.
Responding. There's a couple of people on the chat. There was baby stuff. There was refill stuff. There was relieving the bladder stuff. But
kitty cat stuff. There's kitty cat somewhere around in there.
A lot of stuff. But yeah, no, you had my rapt attention the whole time. One of the, it's hard for me to be passive a lot of times because I'm so used to engaging an issue. But it's a necessary exercise, and I think, like I was discussing with somebody else today, you need to have dialogue. You need to also have lecture. You also need to have quiet meditation and contemplation. All these things. Nothing's more important than the other. Go ahead
and talk. I know I had to kind of run through it at the end there because we were sort of running short on time, but it's that
got a little bit of a late start too.
So, what about that were you thinking about? Now's a good time to.
It's a lot of times, I'm left with more impressions than questions. Thinking about how the people in the situations are like feeling. Because to me, the thing that I love about the Bible is that it is both history and mythology. It is a true myth, and I love the pictures. Yeah. And so one of the most essential parts of it is the human element. How and I think you really drew that out a lot in a very awesome way about Rachel's lament and the cry of David's heart and what's going on in the hearts of the wicked, like Herod, and how it all comes back to these very basic human desires that we're continually trying to resolve before our Creator. And we see, just like in Hebrews, it puts forth how Christ is always the answer. He always answers it in ways that we don't even understand yet. But the picture, this is where I appreciate more liturgical traditions, because it's not so much about that heady academic stuff. It's about the imagery. It's about letting the impact. Yeah, exactly. Iconography, and it's like letting the impact of the beauty of the moment conform you in some way. It's just like I was saying a minute ago, that all of the above approach. And if you haven't noticed, I've swung vastly towards more liturgical traditions in the past couple of years. Still valuing the academia of the more the heady stuff. And the Roman Catholic Church is not at all outside of that either. But
they still do a lot of that.
Yeah, I'm really struck by Rachel and how.
She doesn't take less than total comfort. She's not going to be comforted with anything less.
Right, and where I was going to go with that is that, especially Calvinists, but even Arminians to a degree, and others, because they're not the only two in Protestantism, Calvinists really have a way of divorcing themselves from that attachment to their progeny when it comes to damnation. And it seems very much, It's, and they have to for the soundness of their theology, but it seems very unnatural. And if anything, God is our archetype, and at the core of our being, we are his image. And so something like that, when you so violate something that's so intrinsic to being human, I think, the philosophical, theological justifications aside, I think at that point, you've so skewed yourself that you'll believe anything. You know, at that point, you can truly justify it. Yeah, and it doesn't really go that extreme most of the time. You know, it doesn't go the way of Jim.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't go like Muslim extreme, but it could.
What it does
because it did with the Muslims.
Well, I mean, there's also plenty. You know, you got the Spanish Inquisition. You got the Salem, things like that. But what I'm saying is, more often than not, it takes the form of this subtle, quiet resignation into this non-feeling, non-thinking acceptance of something that you know deep down inside
it's a non-salvational attitude.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And we get back to human connection.
And it's a non-salvational attitude that, speaking from my own experience, but I know I can see this happening from the Calvinist side too, but from my own experience as an Arminian, it's a non-salvational attitude that allows you to foster that I can hate somebody and it's okay.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
I can hate them with a perfect hate. That's what David did, right? So,
and how quickly we forget the Old Testament, where it says God does not delight in the destruction of the wicked.
Yeah. Well, he kind of does, not ultimately. No, he doesn't.
The delight he has is in consuming the wickedness, not the person. The person is brought through the fire, you know, but by the skin of their teeth.
We talked about that in an earlier episode, where the chapter in Isaiah where he starts off saying, "I don't have any wrath in me. These people come out and go to war against me. I'll fight them." But they're carrying thorns and thistles in order to come out to war against me. They're using those as their weapons to fight me. I'm burning those up.
I got the perfect geek metaphor. God is like he's like Captain America's carbonadium shield.
Oh, that's
you know how it perfectly returns all kinetic energy? It's a perfect kinetic mirror. So no matter how hard you hit it with that hammer, it's going to hit the hammer back just as hard, and that hammer will shatter every time.
Actually, there are scriptures there's at least one scripture in the Old Testament that's basically that. It's talking about the rock of God and how he's going to choose this rock. Of course, it could be Israel, but it's also a reference to the Messiah. And anything that rock falls on shatters it to dust. Anything falls on the rock, it breaks.
Right.
It's basically Captain America's shield.
I wanted to, if I can get it back real quickly. Damn it, I closed it. Let me see. Reopen, close tab. Reopen, close tab. I wanted to read a comment that someone had made. No,
sure. Yes. Because I don't get to see the comments really from where I'm at, so I could, but I'm usually got stuff on the screen that I can't really see.
TEUS. Still hard to get our stuff to come up in a search, and I tagged the hell out of it. Okay, I was linked to it before from.
Where was the comment at?
For the people, it's you can't see it until you're like on the other end of the feed, so you gotta be on the receiving end. Yeah. I just done that for shits and giggles earlier. And the cool thing is when we're broadcasting, oh, there it is. Hold on. I was just talking. It's like a 5-second delay, so it's really weird to see myself up there like that. Of course, Vince says Happy New Year, and he thought the Game of Thrones reference was pretty funny.
Oh.
And the one other person that commented was Christopher Drake. He said he really appreciates these teachings. Thanks. So,
thank you.
Yeah, I said back to him, it's our pleasure to bring it to you, Christopher, and it is our hope that it will be a blessing to all those who hear and carry the grace of Christ to his sheep, lost, found, and soon to be found.
Yes, it's got to be evangelical, see? It should help you with your evangelism.
I worked that in there. See what I did there? So, you know, and I've lost count. I don't know if people are messaging you because you're not on Facebook a lot. So you might not get a lot of the interactions. But I've heard from a lot of people that have said that they, you know, they follow this religiously. They'll watch every single
Hopefully
one.
not religiously.
And it's really,
I'm not a cult leader. No, don't. I know what you meant.
It's made all the difference in the world when, you know, they're going to church. And I think Craig Schmidt is one who would talk to me about this. So, you know, they go to church, and he's a pastor too. They go to church and they hear the typical preaching, and they go through the typical assumptions that people have. And it's so difficult to figure out how to confront this without seeming like a contrarian, you know, how to not be pugnacious about it.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You know, pierce through the veil of, and it really is a thinly veiled attempt to make God into our own image as this spiteful being who wants to take things out on you, when nothing can be further from the truth. Yeah. It's the same thing of finding contempt towards a father who cares enough to spank his child to correct him.
Yeah. And we have to watch out, and I realize we have to watch out the other way too, because there is the charge that, you know, Universalists are just trying to make God out to be like us. And that's, and I'm like, wait, I don't care about sinners. I really don't. I really have no emotional care for sinners to amount to anything, and I was just perfectly happy with them frying. not all sinners, but you know,
I'm one of the very people who's honest enough to say that there's a part of my heart that there's a certain segment of people that I'm not okay with, you know, being forgiven, and I need to recognize that that's a deficiency within
That's a problem
myself.
with me. Yeah, that's a problem with me.
Exactly. Because that's not the heart of Christ.
It's a problem I may not be able to get over right this time, but I should just be looking to get over it. Just like any of our sins. And sometimes there's some sins we just can't get past at the moment, but we should be looking. It's like George MacDonald talks about how the fetters that are keeping us chained up as slaves. You know, sometimes they're gold and sometimes they're iron or whatever. He says, you know, there's people out there that don't even have those fetters on anymore. He said, but the rest of us, if we've still got them on, at least let them be chafing us. Don't let them be gold. Don't be sitting there treating them like Ring from Lord of the Rings. You know, at least they've got to. At least you should want them off. You can't get them off yet, but at least you should want them off. You've got to be against them. And so a lot of the things I've talked about this in previous episodes, that when I first came from Trinitarian theism and putting all the stuff together and then realizing, well, wait a minute, if Trinitarian theism is true, then basically I should be expecting God to save everybody from their sins. That wasn't what I intended when I started this study. That's pretty whack. And I mean, I realize there's some places in scriptures that kind of sound like that, but surely there's a lot of other places that don't. So, you know, I was like, well, okay, I'll kind of study around and you know, keep things Trinitarian and check out other things. And as I started reading around over the years in different parts of the scriptures, I would get to them, and I'd see Jesus, especially in the Gospels, but also God in the Old Testament sometimes. And he'd be denouncing. Who's he denouncing? Well, he's denouncing his own chief servants. And why is he denouncing them? Because they don't have a salvational heart for saving other people from their sins. And I'm like, well, obviously that's me. He's denouncing me, and I can see why he's right to do it. That's pretty harsh. I understand. I get that. I totally, absolutely get that. You know, so.
And these are the layers. These are the layers that we have to peel through, because before you can solve anything, you need to see it for what it is. So, you know, one of the most important things that we can do in our walk with Christ is keep our eyes fixated on Him. In a very emotional sense. I mean, be attached to Him, but at the same time, take a very passive, dispassionate look at ourselves, and just see ourselves like, you know, from a completely, like as though we're a computer. Just look at us from a completely third-person perspective.
Yeah, it's got to be self-critical, but not hopelessly self-critical.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't want to. There is no condemnation in Christ Jesus. It's just that simple. But there is accountability. And if you're not willing to see
that is great. That is well put. And that's why I was really trying to get to that earlier and kind of got off. But it was like, okay, there are types of what I call fluffy universalism out there. And I don't necessarily mean the people who think that there is no punishment coming from God at all. those people can still be very strong Christian Universalists, and I understand their general arguments. And you know, there's healing and there's excusing, and you know, once those are done, if that accounts for everything, that accounts for everything. Then God has saved the person. Great.
Right.
I hope that's. I would be glad if that was everybody. I kind of doubt that it's going to be everybody like that, but that doesn't mean that there's, you know, there's still, but okay. But so when I'm saying that there's fluffy universalism, I don't mean them necessarily. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about just, you know, the kind of popular sort of, yeah, if you're just good enough, you'll be getting in. I don't really care. Who cares? This is kind of the idea of, well, if anybody's going to be saved, then why even bother? Well, that's the wrong attitude. That's a,
well, it ignores.
And I understand that attitude from. I understand that attitude from rank atheists and other people like that. What kind of bugs me is when I hear that from fellow Christians. If everybody's going to be saved, what's the point? What's the point of everybody being saved? If everybody's going to be saved,
then everybody gets saved.
Everybody gets saved. Christ wins. Yay!
That's like a pretty big victory to me.
How's this not a problem? Christ
That's
wins.
Turning it up to 11.
Yeah. But there is a fluffy type of universalism too, and I understand we shouldn't get in. That's the other side of that coin, and we should be careful not to get into that. But it's the fluffy type of universalism was never my problem. and to be fair, the ultra universalists who would say that there is no punishment coming from God at all or ever again, they would say I'm still too Zorchi. There could be an argument to that. You know, I understand. I am still rather Zorchi. That's true. It's another question to what extent God actually does punish people, and I think the logic runs out in the scriptures that he does, and you know, it can be pretty awful. it can be very. It can be intense and awful in the old version of awful. You know, it's numinous fear awful. Right. But that's. But I understand that's a part of my heart that there's like, oh yeah, it's awesome.
I don't think we gotta get too complicated about it. I think that the scriptures are pretty straightforward. Like I said, especially in that 1 Corinthians passage, I believe 1 Corinthians 3, where it's either 3 or 5, but I'm pretty sure it's 3, where it talks about, you know, we all have our works, some of wood, hay, and stubble, others gold, silver, right. When we pass through the fire, you know, how many times is God called the all-consuming fire? And what is fire a symbol of, if not of judgment?
Yeah,
you know, that was
purification.
Yeah. The
energy
whole
and light and all kinds of interesting things that relate to God, which is why it's used for him as a symbol.
Right. All we're talking about here is us being confronted with the weight of our own iniquity, not the vengeful reaction of some kind of other free moral agent. We're talking about the reflection, like I said, that carbonadium shield of Captain America. We're coming up against the wall that says all choices you make are visited upon yourself and yourself only. And this is where the reversal comes.
There are times when choices we make are visited on other people too, and that's. But no, I know what you mean. Yeah, that's
right. What I'm saying when we part this mortal coil and we're left with nothing but the truth, no body, no outs, no deception anymore. We're left confronted with nothing but the absolute reality. Call it ontological reality of our actions throughout our life. Call it a feedback loop. One way or the other, unbeing and being are mutually exclusive. And all those things that represent that motion towards the unbeing are subsumed in being. And what's left over is the preponderance of who you are. And sometimes that comes by the path of Torah, as the Jews would say. Sorry. Yeah,
it's supposed to be a self-critical, self-disciplinary action to be faithful to the Torah. Yeah.
The very first step is letting go of preconceptions. It seems like the last thing that religious people want to do.
Well, sometimes it is, and there's irreligious people. It's just human nature. Yeah. And preconceptions are important. I mean, there's a reason that you have to be wary about letting go of your preconceptions, because typically they're not always there for bad reasons, and they help you out.
Standing firm, yes, absolutely.
But you still have to, walk according to the light you can see, and look for more light thereby. If you're not walking according to what light you can see, you're at best you're just ignoring the light. And if you're not looking for more light, then by walking according to what light you can see, you're never going to make any progress. So
Right.
you might lead to wander off in the darkness.
I'm getting to the point where the darkness is coming in.
I see. And you can open the windows.
So, the sun is going down, and it's getting to the point where you're going to get a little more than gibberish from me, because this was a good, thought-intensive session. So I think I'll use this as the opportunity to segue into a good farewell to all of our viewers. Hopefully, we'll get the next episode up and running soon.
I've already done a lot of work on it, and there's still a lot more to go, but I'll be able to segue into it, at least because I made a reference to one of those parables that's going to be in it. So at least.
And we still going to talk about the Apostle Peter Superstar.
Oh yeah, that's going to be a different thing. We have to do that, and it won't take long. But if you wanted to stop this and then start over again on a different recording, we could do that. That's okay. It won't take long. I'm
not going to do that tonight. Oh,
not going to do it tonight. Okay. All right.
No. I'm getting burnt.
Okay.
We can do We can do just a random, freeform show sometime in the near future.
Yeah. Actually, that would be a good thing to do a random freeform show on, because it is so great. I can just tell the story from memory. It's crazy.
Awesome. All right. So I'm gonna end this broadcast right quick here, and thanks again for another awesome exercise in exegesis, showing us how it's supposed to be done anyway. And hopefully, I gotta get over to where I can actually click the button. There's so much stuff.
It's so dark now. Where's the button to turn it off? Help! Turn it off.
I'm the sound engineer. I'm the video engineer. I'm the host, and you're the brain. And here we go. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a happy new year. I hope 2018 is awesome, and you realize that God loves you no matter what a jerk you are. Peace and